That was Rachel Susser, who just finished her first year at Barnard. So thank you very much, Rachel. Hi, everybody. For those of you I don't know, I'm Cyndi Stivers, class of 1978, and a Barnard trustee. I have the privilege of hosting what is the 8th annual Moth at Barnard reunion. And I'll tell you the story of how that came to be. Those of you who are, sort of 70s classes and above, do you remember what reunion used to be like? It was sort of Irma Moore and Tony Coffey in a room, sort of just coming up with the best they could do in their spare time when they already had the job of about 8 people. You remember what that was like? Anyway, Irma is here and Tony is here, and I think we should thank them for all those years of really hard work. But late in the sort of turn of the 2000s, Barnard realized that we really needed to invest in all of our fabulous alums and come up with reunion programming that could bring people back to campus, not just on their anniversary years, but actually people like me coming back. It's not a big 5 or 10 year for me, but I come back every year now for this show and the other programming. And I was chair of reunion for 3 years, and at the end of every year, the alums would say the most rewarding part of the weekend for me was meeting other alums, sometimes students, sometimes people in completely different classes, and hearing the stories about what the college was like in their day. So Istar Swager, class of 68, said, there's this fabulous storytelling organization called the Moth, which I had just heard of too, but she was an advisor to it. And thank you, Istar, for the introduction. Turned out to be incredibly fortuitous. So it has happily become a grand tradition of reunion. This year, as in years past, dozens of people applied, wrote in, and told their outline of their story. And then the amazing women of the Moth, Kate Tellers, our director this year, and there's a whole crew of them who have come over the years and put us through our paces and taught us how to get into Moth storytelling. So the key, there are rules. It's got to have a beginning, middle, and an end. It's got to be true. You cannot use any notes, as scary as that is, right, women? But those are the rules. And also, you have to do it within a set amount of time. So our timekeeper is actually Rachel Susser. If anyone goes over on their time, past their 7 minutes, Kate's going to give her the high sign. And what will happen, Rachel? Okay, so a little gentle reminder. And if, on the off chance, because we know Barnard women take directions so well, they go beyond that gentle warning, what happens, Rachel? Whoa, okay. So I'm sure it won't come to that, but in any case, so I will remind you a little bit more about the Moth at the end. I think we'll just get into the show now, but it recently won a Peabody Award, right? It has now as the Moth Storytelling Hour on, Public Radio Exchange. So on NPR stations, public radio. Okay, so there's just a little bit, but let's get to our stories, I think. So our first storyteller is, I need to cheat on her year, Mae Yih, 1951. We have a half century of alums coming up for you right now.
I served on the Oregon legislature for 26 years. How did it happen? When my children went to elementary school in Albany, Oregon, I was often asked to bring cookies for Valentine's Day, chaperone students to the zoo on field trips, and cook hot dogs to give them hot lunches. I always said no first because I was busy building our new house. But I thought about what President McIntosh said every week during students' assembly. Use your education. Be involved in the decision-making process for the benefit of your community. I said to myself, I better help, and I did. I became a room mother, a Cub Scouts den mother, a hot lunch program coordinator, vice president of the PTA, and president of the PTA. One day, the school secretary said to me, there's going to be a vacancy on the school board. Are you interested in serving? So I attended a school board meeting just to see what it was like, and I was appalled. The board members, all men. They spent an hour talking about which riding lawnmower the school should buy. But only 5 minutes on the non-renewal of a teacher. And that teacher happened to be my favorite because she assigned homework to students, and very few of them did. Out of frustration at the unfair decision, I ran for the school board and won. And I want to tell you that I was born and raised in Shanghai, China. During the Second World War, the girls' school I attended lost its beautiful campus to the Japanese Army hospital. The school had to move to a small building in the city. The building could only accommodate half-day schools to each grade. However, it was enough to cover all the basic courses. We had 4 hours of classes and 4 hours of homework every day, plus an hour of calligraphy brush writing every night. My high school education, although given in half days, prepared us well. I didn't have any trouble studying my courses in English at Barnard and finished half a year earlier than anticipated. This explains why I believe quality education does not have to be expensive. Students need to be taught strong, challenging courses, and they need to study hard to learn. During war years, we were extremely frugal with our supplies because of shortages. We recycle everything. We even repair worn-out light bulbs and mend torn nylon stockings. Later, when my sons were away at schools and my husband was busy traveling due to his job, I ran for the high school board and won. I was very controversial on the high school board without knowing it. As an example, I voted no on the high school budget, which asked for a 13% increase when cost of living increase was only 7% and student enrollment has declined. The superintendent wanted to purchase land for possible future growth. I also voted no on the approval of curriculum without giving board members any time for review. Soon after the controversial school board meeting, the Democrat county chairman called and wanted me to run for the Oregon House of Representatives, opposing a 7-term Republican incumbent. I told him I didn't know anything about politics and had no interest in entering politics. However, the Democrats were very encouraging. So with friends on both sides of me holding onto my arms, they walked me to the desk where I signed my name with a trembling hand and filed for the Oregon House race. I knew I had a lot to learn and work to do, but I believe that answering the call to serve is my duty as a citizen of this great country. My campaign theme was always, government needs to live within its income, the same as families do. Set priorities and be accountable for its spending and its services. I promise hard work, honesty, and common sense. And I won the election by 51% of the votes. And I went on to win 7 more elections, retiring. Retiring in 2003. President McIntosh changed my life. If it weren't for her weekly advice, I would not be what I am today. Be involved is her legacy to her students. I'm grateful. I'm one of them.
Right for you to... Woo. Thank you, Mae. That was great. Now, you probably sensed the theme for today, which is Mentors, Muses, and Monsters, which comes from the title of a book by Elizabeth Benedict, who is here someplace. There she is, class of '76, and who will be signing books in the back at the end of this session. So now we know, I wanted you to hear one before you knew what the theme was. And now we have Toby Stein, class of 1956.
Hello. I went to a terrific high school. Terrific and a little odd. At Performing Arts, all our academics were crammed into the morning so that all afternoon we could do what we'd really come there to do, learn to perform. That was probably one of the reasons I was accepted to Barnard, how different PA was. But that wasn't the kind of reason that would make me think I'd fit in. If I was different, so was my mother. My mother was interesting, elegant, warm, and old. She'd be 60 that year. Doesn't seem quite so old to me now. But I thought that all the mothers in '56 would have to be way younger than my mother. I mean, decades younger than my mother. The teachers also look kind of young to me, especially Miss Rosalie Coley, in whose freshman English section I ended up. She was also brilliant and very stern. That didn't scare me. It made me want to do good work in her class. But something did scare me. It was all the other girls in the class, especially the ones who came from those notorious high schools in Brooklyn. I thought of them as academic redwoods, towering over me. When the first test came back, I expected to get the lowest mark in the class, and I got a C-, no surprise. And as I was glancing at the test, someone behind me spoke up and said, "You can't give me a C-. I had a 98.6 average." Wild with relief, I blurted out, 98.6, I thought that was normal temperature. But I knew that cracking wise wasn't going to help me do well in the class. The very next day, I moved up to the front row, decided to listen only to what was said up there, and instructed my brain that maybe it was time to kick in. Parents' Day came early that year. My mother was very, very enthusiastic about meeting Miss Coley. I was not enthusiastic about having Miss Coley meet her. My mother was also brilliant, but in a Russian accent, and I somehow didn't see them together. I told myself that my mother, unlike all the other mothers, would be the only one who had finished the work for a doctorate at the University of Kiev. I told myself that my mother had the best posture of any mother in the world. I swallowed my anxiety. It stuck in my throat. But the day came, and at the end of class, my mother lined up with all the other mothers, and I went with her and stood waiting for what I thought would be a long wait, and the line moved very fast, and then we were there. And inside a moment, my mother and Miss Coley were engaged in a real conversation, completely ignoring me, and everyone standing behind us on line waiting to speak to Miss Coley. And I began to hear some murmuring from that direction. I got very anxious, seemed to be a habit, and I ran from there to my next class. That night, my mother said that Miss Coley was indeed very smart for someone so young, and delightful. Delightful, Miss Coley? The next day, Miss Coley said to me that my mother was a fantastically interesting woman. Gotcha from both sides, Toby. We had to go to Miss Coley's office to pick up papers. I went to pick up my first paper, which was on Père Goriot, and yes, I remember which paper it was. And when I got there, she said, sit, you know, like a dog, sit, and I sat, and I saw there was no mark, not a good sign. And as I was sitting there, without a word, she put a B in the top right-hand corner of the paper, and she had her pen still poised there, and I was watching for the minus sign, and she put a period there instead. B, period. I don't know how many straight-up Bs Miss Coley gave that October, but it didn't matter. I didn't have to take the bus home. I floated all the way to Washington Heights. Sometime after that, but not very long, Miss Coley decided to mentor me, that I just might be worth it. She started by giving me a very long list of books on yellow lined paper. Very long. I didn't know a single one of them. The second thing was that a paper or two later, she said, if you would learn to outline and be more rigorous and pay attention more to what you were writing, you might one day write a real book. It wasn't a compliment, it was a challenge. That's how Miss Coley mentored. You meet one challenge, she'd have another come right up at you. But I didn't resent it. It excited me. After Christmas vacation, I came back raring to go, really ready to work hard in her class, and she wasn't there. She was gone. We were told only that we could not contact her. I thought she must be very sick for us to be told that. But I made a resolution, and she turned overnight from mentor to muse in my life. I decided that with her as inspiration, I would work just as hard as I'd been working when she was there. And I did. I really drove myself the way she had driven me, and I was hard on myself the way she'd been hard on me, and I began to do good work. And I wanted her to know that, but there was no way to let her know. Sometime after the midpoint of the second semester, I got a crazy idea. If I could win the Gildersleeve Prize, her best friend, who also worked at Barnard, would tell her what a great get-well card that would make. But how could I win? There were all those redwoods in my class and in all the other sections. I couldn't pay attention to them. I decided that all I could focus on was making an outline, focusing on the work, and doing the damn best work I had ever done. And I did that, and I won the Gildersleeve Prize. A week later, I got a note from Miss Coley. She got the whole picture. The next year, she was back. She had not softened herself. Illness hadn't done a thing to make her a more tender teacher. On me, she was tougher than ever. And I stood it. The first semester was okay. I just worked my butt off. The second semester, she assigned something I really couldn't stand. We had to analyze a sonnet. I didn't like analyzing poetry. I still don't like analyzing poetry. And I gave the task short shrift. When I went to pick up my paper, she tossed it across the desk at me and said, if this were anyone else's, I'd give it an F. I wish I didn't remember what I answered, but I do. I said, so give me an F. She shook her head, and in a voice as calm as wood, she said, Easter vacation is coming up. You will analyze 5 sonnets in 5 separate papers and have them on my desk the day we get back. 5 papers in 9 days. I did it. But I decided she'd pushed me too far that time. She probably thought she should have pushed me much harder earlier. In any event, any exchanges we had the rest of the semester were in very clipped sentences. That summer, my mother died. And Barnard, believing in loco parentis, found a dorm room for me. I was unpacking my books when I heard a scurrying in the hall, a quick rap at the door, and it flung open. There she was, not waiting to be asked to come in, of course. And she looked me over head to foot and said, you're not wearing black. Good. Grab a sweater. There's a faculty tea over at Columbia. You're coming with me. She didn't say anything about our anger the previous spring. She didn't say anything about what a terrible summer I must have had. She didn't say she'd always be there for me from then on. And that was the day I learned some things don't need to be said. I grabbed a sweater and followed her out the door.
Great job, Toby. Okay, our next teller is Joyce Roman Brenner, class of Rosman.
Rosman.
Oh,
Brenner.
I'm sorry. There's a typo in my.
Oh, my goodness.
Anyway, class of 61.
Correct.
Right? She's a pro.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. It was August 1997, and I had just returned from New York to Israel. It was boiling hot, and I was jet-lagged terribly, and the phone did not stop ringing for one moment. I had no idea what they were talking about. They kept asking me, how do you feel about the appointment? I was thinking, what appointment? I literally was so jet-lagged, I had no idea what was going on. Finally, the penny dropped, and I realized that in June, a left-leaning political friend of mine had asked me if I would be willing to be the appointee for the Religious Council of Netanya as the first Reform representative. And I said, what do I have to do? And she said, nothing. And so there it started. Well, I nearly brought down the government because what happened, and it's very interesting, is if some of you know or don't know, Israel is not a country where there is separation of religion and politics. And so the Orthodox coalition was very against my appointment, and they were pulling out. The Supreme Court approved my appointment, and the Minister of Religious Affairs resigned, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who was then the Prime Minister, signed me on. And so began my love affair, or my 15 minutes of fame with the media. I was on every television channel, every newspaper, every radio show, commenting on the Religious Council, which I learned how to comment on very quickly. But what was really fascinating is I became known all over Israel. People would come up to me and say, you are so brave. People would say, watch your back, you never know what will happen. People, when I had to be escorted by the police to meetings, and when I was given Purim treats, people said, are you sure they're not poisoned? Well, anyway, that was my 15 minutes of fame, and it was quite a moment. And why? Because the word reform is a word that is so totally negative that I was totally unaware of at that time. So you might wonder, as I am wondering, how did a young woman from Brooklyn, from an Orthodox background, come to become the iconoclast of Israel in 1997? I grew up in Brooklyn, a very safe, secure childhood, and I can't answer the question for you except to say that going to Barnard probably was the beginning of my changes. And what happened at Barnard, a group of us were walking in Harlem together with Dr. Gladys Myers. She was our professor of sociology. And we were going to be doing volunteer work for our practicum that year. We were so young, so naive, so kind of adorable. We were wearing skirts and heels because in those days we had a dress code, and we girls, as we called ourselves then, were going into the neighborhoods that we had never been in. And she asked us, she said, "How do you feel?" And we said, nervous, scared, terrified. And she said, "Okay, that's honesty, and we're going to now begin to talk about that." And that was the beginning of Dr. Myers teaching me how to express who I was, the me that I didn't even know existed at that time. The amazing part of the story with Gladys Myers is during those walks and talks, she shared with us that she was the safe address for any of the girls at Barnard who got into trouble. Abortion, any problems we had, we could go to her, and there were many young women who did. So Dr. Myers is really the person I think about when I think who influenced me the most. She was quiet, she was direct, she was understated, but somehow she conveyed to us the principles that we knew we needed to care about. And somehow she conveyed to me that there is an awful lot of world out there besides the Brooklyn world that I grew up in. After graduation, I went to Israel, and the story then is just the story. I decided I was going to live in Israel, where I have been living for 30 years. I got my MSW. I got my doctorate in social work as well. I became a social work educator, a social work political activist, and a feminist therapist. And I have to say, so much of it is because of what Dr. Myers set in motion. So I became the me that I'm very proud of, and I think I conveyed that sense of self to my students, my clients, and to the people I love. So thank you for letting me share this story with you today.
That's great. Okay, our next speaker, I might need to make it higher for you, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Would have been in, how's that?
That's good.
Okay, in the class of 1970, but she took a little bit of a detour. And so Kathy Erskine Jenkins, 86?
86.
Okay.
Got my diploma in the mail. You know, the first thing that struck me about her was she had 2 rows of perfect little white teeth, and they were stretched in a perpetual grin. It wasn't so much a smile as it was like the grid of an oncoming car. Eventually, I understood exactly what was behind that grin. But to a kid who never colored outside the lines, Kate Millett was full frontal fabulous. With her great draping scarves and her chestnut hair down to her waist and her rage that was like a force field around her. Apparently, she knew something that I did not, that there was something really terribly wrong with the whole entire setup. And she had written a book about it. This was 1970. It was the beginning of the second wave of the women's liberation movement, and she had just written its manifesto. So one evening, I'm in my room at Fairholme, off-campus housing, and it must have faced due west because every evening at 6 o'clock, this big orange ball would fill my window, and my poet's soul would be roused to think of phrasing for it. Sodom ablaze, I would think, as the sun bathed the surrounding tenement roofs in its golden fire. Amsterdam apocalypto, I would say, and think upon my future as a writer. The light would glance into my room as well, and it would hit, for example, the silver tea tray from my grandmother's Bronxville home, and on her marble top table, more treasure from that home. in this quaint traditional setting sat a newly purchased copy of Sexual Politics. So I thought, well, here I am at Barnard. Kate Millett was my major advisor. I'm going to read this thing. So I flop down on my Bloomingdale's bedspread and crack open Sexual Politics. Whoa! They're doing it on the first page. It's over by the second page. This is her dissertation? Well, I leaf a little bit farther back through it, and there's D.H. Lawrence, a chapter on him, and I think, well, he's a sweet, sexy writer. Let's see, whoa! I guess he doesn't like us very much. But let me check out this chapter on Norman Mailer. Jeez! He really hates us too. No wonder Beverly stabbed him in the neck. A little farther on, Henry Miller, well, I know what to expect. Oh my God! I knew he was kinky, but I guess he doesn't like us very much either. So this is all about oppression, subjugation, exploitation, patriarchy. Hold the phone. Here I am, a nice, apparently extraordinarily naive young lady from the Upper East Side. And my experience with men, since I went to all-girls school from kindergarten through college, the Spence School, Emma Willard, Barnard College, you know, as my daughter said, I missed the whole boy drama of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. My experience with men? Well, anyone who wanted to cha-cha with me at Miss Harris's dancing classes at the Cosmopolitan Club would have to bring me tribute. Perhaps a velvet headband embroidered with butterflies, or maybe a little tin ladybug pin, something like that. But that was it. Even my father, rejected from the army for flat feet. And while he was a lawyer, yes, he was a good lawyer, but all of his clients were toys. Raggedy Ann and Andy, Little Lulu, the Bobbsey twins. We weren't exactly a family of sharks. So, tragically, my parents passed before they were able to give me real-world advice. But I was leaving Barnard. I was a woman warrior. I was going to go out and take on the boys' clubs. And so I headed to Madison Avenue, where the men wear wingtips and bespoke suits. They give jobs to women, and they actually pay them. So off I went. And you know, I did pretty well. Young and Rubicon, Time Incorporated, Saatchi and Saatchi, up, up, up. And 3 of my dreams came true. The first, I got married. Someone asked me. Remember now, the class of 70 was one of the first to send more women to the workplace than down the aisle. Second, I had a beautiful baby girl, a miracle, in my 40s. Thank you, Pergamol. And third, I got to form my own agency, just a little one within a big one, and I was partnered with a young man about 10, 12 years my junior, high, wide, and handsome, great with a spreadsheet, right from central casting. You know, he would do the numbers, I would sing the songs, and together we built a great client base. Years passed, we prospered, and our parent company recognized our success by making him CEO of a group of companies, including ours. And so then there was a great cocktail coronation. It was at the fancy restaurant, the one with the expense account awning, the one with the oak paneling and the red damask walls, and the piano that didn't play itself. And there were the assembled executives of all these new companies. And here I was standing with my former partner, now boss, and he put his arms around me, just one arm really, and he raised his glass of Barolo, and he proclaimed to the assembled, "This is the woman I rode to the top." Well, this was not exactly the tribute I was looking for. This was no little velvet headband with butterflies embroidered on it. This was no little tin pin. And I did not immediately think of Kate Millett. She wasn't a blunt object. I wouldn't have minded having a copy of Sexual Politics with me, because that, indeed, was a heavy book. So heavy, in fact, that at their 100th celebration of publishing, Doubleday named Sexual Politics one of the top 10 most important books that they had ever published. So the lesson was, no, don't back away, don't not try, go for it. Be everything you can be, but be warned.
Is there anyone else here who took Kate? Any chance? Yeah, there's a hand. What do you know? Okay, our next storyteller is Nancy Lerner Frey, class of 76. Okay, do you need help with this, or are you good? Left, there. Okay, is that good? I think you're good. Great.
My story begins with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It was the fall of 1974, and I had just returned to Barnard after a year of traveling by backpack in Europe and working as a secretary and a large public accounting firm in Kansas City. And this was a year that was full of park benches and hitchhiking and perhaps a story for another day. But I returned to the Barnard campus and I was feeling far from home. I was feeling academically rusty, and I was feeling completely at odds with my surroundings. So I decided that in order to get grounded, I was going to find a major. So I started on my journey to figure out what my major was going to be, and I tried on all kinds of things for size. First of all, I thought, well, maybe I'll be a classics major. So for a while, I imagined myself planning my semester off in Rome and learning to laugh while reading Aristophanes. That didn't work. Then I thought, well, maybe I'll be a physicist. So I imagined myself walking around campus with a white lab coat, with a pencil stuck behind my ear, and that didn't work either. So in order to be more efficient, a friend of mine said, well, why don't you meet with my advisor, Annette Baxter? I'm a history major. She's the chair of the department and also the head of the American Studies program. Maybe she can help you. So I checked her office hours. I headed up to Lehman during her lunch hour and found myself outside of an open room and peeked my head in and saw this sun-filled room cluttered with books and papers and photographs. And there was Annette Baxter sitting at her desk eating lunch. And she gestured to me to come in, and she said, would you care for half of my sandwich? So I sat down, and we started talking. And we talked and we talked. We talked about our favorite books. We talked about our favorite places. We talked about my aimlessness. And Annette had the good sense to steer the conversation towards academic matters and explained the American Studies program and how she felt it would be a really good fit for my eclectic interests. So 90 minutes later, I left her office. I had a major, and I also had a mentor. I have lots and lots of memories of conversations with Annette during my years at Barnard, and one of them sticks out, and I'd like to share with you. I was writing a paper on the poet Hart Crane for one of Annette's seminars, and Hart Crane was a poet who took the New York literary scene by storm in the 1920s by writing several spectacular pieces, one of them the poem The Bridge, and jumped to his death at the age of 33 from the deck of a ship. And I became transfixed with this notion of the alienated artist who led a tragic life, who was misunderstood by society. And so I wrote a draft of the paper that just heaped on every reference I could find to this part of his life. And I could not wait to share it with Annette. So I marched into her office when I was finished, and I sat down, I handed her the paper, and she went through it very carefully, page by page. And as she turned the last page over, and I'm rubbing my hands together, waiting for the accolade, she took off her glasses, looked me in the eye, and said, "My dear, don't you ever fall prey to sentimentality again. This is a paper that is just a corny tribute to another artist who committed suicide. You've lost sight of your scholarship, you have lost sight of the facts, and you have missed what's true and real. You have to get beyond the obvious." So I picked up the papers, walked out of her room, tore them in half, cried all the way down to the corner of the library, and rewrote the paper from start to finish. And over the years, as my relationship with Annette evolved and our conversations went from the seminar room or her office to her kitchen table or her dining room table, I found that I was learning to think on my feet and take care of myself in virtually any set of circumstances. And I mimicked her love of culture, both high and low. So while Annette was a fan of Elvis and the opera, I found myself gravitating towards Jerry Lewis and Robert Wilson. She was an expert in the work of Henry Miller, and I became a follower of Saul Bellow. And I secretly saw myself as a mini Annette, which gave me permission at the time to define myself as a feminist who had the kind of dignity and grace that she had. It was a Friday afternoon, September 16th, 1983, and I'd woken up with a horrible flu and headachy and achy and full of regret. I reached for the phone and called Annette and told her that I would not be able to join her and her family for the weekend at their home in Fire Island. I had been looking forward to this for months, and I was just terribly upset that I was too ill to go. And so that weekend, as I groveled and felt sorry for myself in my apartment on the Upper West Side, the Baxter's home was engulfed in flames in a fire, and Annette perished with her husband and another guest. I don't think I need to explain to an audience with the emotional fluency as you have what it's like to mourn the loss of someone you love, or even to deal with the consequences of avoiding tragedy by circumstance. But I will tell you that I managed my missing of Annette by continuing to have conversations with her. And over the course of time, we continued to talk about things that were big and small. I found myself seeking her advice about everything from entrepreneurial decisions to the length of my wedding dress. I cried on her shoulder when I was sick as a dog during the entire first trimester with both of our daughters. And I felt her hugs of joy and pride when I accomplished things like launching the Lycée in Chicago or closing a round of venture funding for a new business. And in between, we had conversations about all the little things that hardly matter, like beautiful summer days and handmade Mother's Day cards. This fall, our younger daughter will enter the Barnard class of 2015. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that Annette would have seen both herself and me as young women in Osty. She is feisty, she is fragile, she's mesmerized by underdogs of every shape and sort. She's bursting with brains and creativity and courage and optimism. And I can so easily see her sitting in that cluttered, sunny office, sharing lunch with Annette in my place. So I've recognized that some people have issues with insomnia and others have issues with intimacy, and I have suffered my entire adult life with the propensity for sentimentality. As Annette had so clearly identified so many years ago. And I have dealt with my demon many times over the course of preparing this story for today. And the place that I get stuck more than anything else has been a simple single line that I stumbled across in one of Annette's obituaries. And the line read, "In the prime of her career, Annette Baxter died in a fire that also killed her husband in their summer home on September 18th, 1983. She was 56 years old." And the sappy symmetry is that as I stand here today, I am 56. So, I can also tell you that there are certain times that I need Annette and no one else will do. I need her encouragement, I need her toughness, I need her humor, I need her perspective. And at those times, I settle in for one of our chats, and I conjure her gestures, I conjure her perfume, I conjure her favorite dress, and I treat myself to a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
That was beautiful, thank you. Okay, Jean Lichty, class of 1981. You probably know how to do this too.
I think so.
You need a little more?
I don't know.
About right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Hi. I left Barnard the first time as an American Studies major with 7 incompletes. I participated in the graduation ceremony but left with no degree. A perfectionist with an undiagnosed ADD and OCD profile. I had duly worked on the papers needed to complete my courses, but couldn't bring myself to turn them in. I felt that they simply weren't good enough. This perfectionism is a mixture of both nature and nurture. My father, a highly talented man, holds himself and his children to the highest standards. Growing up, I would often bring home straight A's on my report card with 1 B, and my father, never acknowledging the A's, would ask, "So Jean, what's up with the B in gym?" Haunted by these 7 incompletes, I would often awake in the middle of the night, panicked from a nightmare about the Barnard registrar calling me or my parents asking, "Are you aware that those 7 I's are about to turn into 7 F's?" And then, 5 summers after I supposedly graduated, I was home visiting my parents, and I received the answer to my prayers. The letter I never knew I was waiting for. A letter from Richard P. Utes, Professor Emeritus and the former chair of the Barnard Psychology Department, asking me to return to Barnard under the auspices of the Resume Student Program, which he had conceived and was now the director of. I discussed it with my parents, never confessing to the incompletes, merely saying that I wanted to return to Barnard to study theater arts. But when my dad drove me to the train that afternoon, I wondered just how much he knew. And when he handed me my luggage at Union Station, with Frank Sinatra's New York, New York blasting out of the loudspeakers, and My Little Town Blues definitely washing away, my dad said, "Jean, get your degree." And I did, thanks to Professor Utes. I returned to Barnard and spoke with several academic deans, always feeling somewhat ashamed about the way I had left Barnard. But when I met with Professor Utes, I knew that I had a mentor who would do what he could to ensure my graduation. I didn't have the money for tuition, and I was far too embarrassed to ask my parents. So Professor Utes guided me through the financial aid application process, and with his help, I was able to get a Pell Grant, a New York State grant, and a federal student loan to cover 3/4 of the tuition. But I didn't have the final quarter, and I didn't know where I was going to get it from. But Professor Utes insisted that I attend classes, which I gratefully did. But then the day before I was supposed to file my program, Professor Utes called me into his office to tell me that I had been awarded a resuming student grant. It was as if I had been awarded a Fulbright. And thus began one of the most gratifying years of my life. And with the aid of Professor Utes, I began to understand why I had accrued so many incompletes and what I could do to avoid repeating that behavior. We met every week, keeping me on track and him abreast. He also suggested that I meet with Professor Roosevelt, Jeanette Roosevelt, who was chair of the Program of the Arts at that time. And I did meet with her. And with her help, she arranged 2 grants so that I could study with William Esper and Robert Neff Williams, 2 legendary New York acting teachers. And as the year progressed, I began to think of and work on my senior performance. And I decided to use a piece that I had been working on in Bill Esper's class. It was a scene from The Farm by David Story, a play about a young Yorkshire woman. And my Barnard Theater advisor suggested that I do a piece from Tennessee Williams, Tell Them Willie Boy Is Here. So I worked very diligently on the scene in Bill's class, and I worked with an acting coach on the Tennessee Williams monologue. But on the morning of the performance, I had invited my father also, who had given me a million pointers on how to do the performance. But on the morning of the performance, I felt compelled to call my mother and say, "Mom, you can't have Dad come." And she yelled, "Jean, he has his foot on the pedal." I said, "Mom, you're going to have to tell him to take his foot off the pedal. I can't have him watch me tonight." But I could have Professor Utes watch me, and indeed he did. He sat in the front row and was the first one to congratulate me backstage after my performance. He said, "Jean, well done, but I have to ask you something. Why didn't you have a Yorkshire accent for the scene from the David Story play? And why didn't you have a Southern accent for the piece, for the Tennessee Williams piece?" Well, I was speechless. I didn't know why. I stammered something about Bill Esper didn't require that at this point in our studies, but I knew as a professional I should have had those accents. But Professor Utes said, "Jean, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it tomorrow morning during our weekly session." So off I went with a few friends whom I had invited, and as we left Millbank Hall, I saw this figure emerge from the shadows, and it was Ramon, my on-again, off-again boyfriend with a dozen roses in his hands. And he gave me the roses and he said, "Baby, you were brilliant tonight." So obviously he was my on-again boyfriend that night. And I proceeded to have my first and last blackout. I remember going to the West End Cafe, and then the next thing I remember is waking up with Ramon in my apartment. And Ramon went to my bathroom to shower, to get ready for work. And I walked in on him and I said, "Ramon," I parted the shower curtain and I said, "Ramon, was I really good last night?" And he said, "Jeannie, I was so proud of you. You were an inspiration." Ramon went off to work and I went back to bed. And then that afternoon, I woke up vaguely remembering that I was supposed to have met with Professor Utes that morning. But I went back to sleep. The next morning, I managed to get to Professor Utes' office. But the moment I walked in, I knew it was a game changer. Crestfallen, he asked me, "Jean, why didn't you call me?" And once again, I was speechless. I didn't know why. I had never stood him up before. I muttered something about I'd had an all-nighter with my on-again, off-again boyfriend. But I knew I had created a breach and had done something irrevocable. The next week, I was walking across campus watching the Barnard grounds people set up for graduation and had a vivid, momentary flash of their announcing Jean Lichty with honors, but immediately dismissed it, thinking, there's no way that's going to happen, not with all those incompletes. but it did happen. And after hearing their announcing of Jean Lichty with theater honors and with my diploma in hand, I descended the podium stairs and met the flash of my father's camera. And with the widest smile and most joyous smile as only my dad can have, he said, "Jeannie, how about that?" And thus ended an extraordinary year, thanks to Professor Utes. And I so wish I could pick up the telephone and call him and tell him that, and also apologize. But he passed away 5 years after I graduated. There were two other important men, Ramon and my father, but Professor Utes was the linchpin. He was the one that connected all the dots. So I can no longer tell him, but I can tell you that last year when I opened as Cherie in Bus Stop, because of Professor Utes, my father sat not in the first row, but in the 5th row. House seats, the best seats in the house.
Okay, and now it's time for our big finish. Sophie Gorlin, class of 2006.
All right. Hi, guys. So I'm the baby of the group. But as I told my fellow storytellers yesterday, I think I might have been more at home in Barnard in the 1950s than I was in Barnard in the early 2000s. So when I got to Barnard, I expected to find the same kind of people that I had found at the Barnard pre-college program. Wholesome, nerdy girls who talked excitedly about books and who had no reason to venture out late into New York City except maybe to attend a poetry slam. So these were the kinds of people I was looking for to be my friends. My first contact at Barnard was my freshman year roommate, with whom I spoke on the phone a couple weeks before we met. So as we're talking, basically I'm trying to figure out if she's one of these wholesome nerds. At first, I'm having a hard time reading her, but then she tells a story, and this is the only thing I remember about this conversation. She tells the story about going to a concert the night before, and how it had been unwise to wear flip-flops because her feet had gotten crushed in the mosh pit. Whoa, the alarm bells are going off in my head. I had been to a concert once in my life, and it was a Janet Jackson concert that I had begged my mom to take me to when I was in 4th grade. The noise and the crowds left me with no desire to ever attend a concert again. Concerts were what cool kids went to in high school, the same kids who went to parties and drank and then asked me what the reading was about so that they could pass the reading quiz. And to be honest with you, I wasn't even sure what a mosh pit was, but I pictured some horrible combination of crowds and toxic substances that was most definitely not nerdy. So I hung up the phone, sadly figuring my roommate and I would not be friends. But finding these people who satisfied my friendship criteria proved harder than I had anticipated. This might not register with some of you, but most of my freshman floor was ruled out by their use of the term booty call, or any reference to being drunk or high. Basically, this left the Catholic girls. But one wanted to be an optometrist for very practical reasons, and I didn't know how to relate to someone practical. And the other wanted to be a chemistry major, and what did I, an English major, have to talk about with a chemistry major? As my Barnard therapist pointed out eventually, my approach to friendship didn't seem to be working for me. Rachel Quimby was not my platonic ideal of a friend either. She wasn't a serious, intense intellectual, but we sort of fell into friendship. I met her at the end of freshman year through the girls who would come to be called by my friend Elsie my Magritte Apple friends. She took this from a line in an exuberant letter I had written her following my first dinner with them. I had gushed, "They say things like, 'Was it Magritte who painted the apples?' Here were the nerds I had been starving for, who did things like play board games and practice juggling on Friday nights with apples from the dining hall, and who brought up Magritte casually and unpretentiously as we shot the breeze at Hewitt. When they introduced me to Rachel a few days later, I exclaimed, "I'm so happy to finally meet wholesome people." "I'm not so wholesome," Rachel had said, totally throwing me at the time, though now I know it was just her characteristic irony. While my friendship with the Magritte Apple kids never really took off, Rachel and I bonded sophomore year, having both the Writing Fellows Seminar and Medieval History together. The spring of sophomore year, Rachel invited me to Passover at her mom's house in Newburgh, New York. Among the guests at the Seder was Remus, one of the lost souls who gravitate to Rachel's mom, like, pardon the simile, moths to a light. Remus was a homeless man who had met Rachel's mom at the local public library. He was a veteran of the First Gulf War and had returned not quite right in the head. So during the pre-Seder chit-chat, Remus says things like, "Be careful what you say in case the house is bugged." And then, in answer to someone's offhand question about his weekend plans, he says, "Sometimes I just don't know what's the point of living." So while most of us are staring at our laps, Rachel says, "Hey, that's just how I used to feel during French class in high school." So everyone laughs, including Remus. She does this over and over again during the Seder. Whenever Remus makes an embarrassing comment, Rachel makes a joke, and everyone laughs. She's not only funny and friendly in this collection of awkward and random individuals, she uses her humor to be kind and inclusive. While I drew lines between myself and others, Rachel drew people to her. Rachel and I have only grown closer since Barnard. Last year, she was one of the few people who visited me while I was teaching on a Fulbright in the Czech Republic. She not only came all the way to my dinky little town, but also came to school and experienced firsthand the absurdity of my teaching situation there. So, 10 minutes before the start of class, we run into the teacher I'm supposed to be teaching with on the stairs. I figure she has the lesson planned since she hasn't checked in with me beforehand. But no, she asks us to just talk about America for 45 minutes to a class of 13-year-olds with very limited English ability. So Rachel and I bolt to the English office and throw together a slapdash routine on the differences between Czech and American schools that, thanks solely to the energy of our dynamic, earns us a round of applause from the 13-year-olds. Now remember, this is the girl who had trouble connecting with a chemistry major her freshman year, and here I was connecting with students and teachers and families across a language barrier in this small town in a foreign country. I could not have done that without Rachel. The highlight of our time together in the Czech Republic, though, and of my entire year abroad, was when our Writing Fellows professor from Barnard, Nancy Piori, and her partner Becky met us in Prague. The four of us stayed in a hotel for academics, courtesy of Fulbright, on a cobblestone street just off the main square. So Nancy and Becky are essentially the people Rachel and I would love to be 40 years from now. Becky is hilarious, like Rachel, and Nancy philosophical, like me. And both of them are highly successful, like all you Barnard women, and like Rachel and I hope to be someday. So we had a truly magical time together, moving easily from cracking jokes to reflecting on what it meant to live life well. In fact, our foursome felt so familial that when we went to the Museum of the City of Prague, I asked the ticket salesman in Czech if we could pay the family price. After all, in my mind, this made sense because there were four of us, the right ages more or less, for parents and children. So the ticket salesman stares at me a moment and then starts laughing. "Who are the kids?" he says. "Them," gesturing to Nancy and Becky. It dawns on me that 26-year-olds are not children, and we're certainly not a typical nuclear family, especially not in the Czech Republic. But for some reason, perhaps simply out of amusement, he sells us a family ticket anyway. I recount this story to the group afterwards, including his joke about Nancy and Becky being the children, to which they respond, "How did he know?" They were just kidding, of course, but it was as if he did know something about us, as if he understood that these were not just two professors and two former students, friends, but two pairs of teammates, exuding such obvious love and admiration for one another that we were nothing short of family.
Okay, so how about one really good rousing round for all of our storytellers?